Well, you said that the deep state has 3 layers.
Yeah.
Describe each one.
So you have permanent Washington in the government agencies. So these are, so the blob here is the foreign policy establishment. This was the Obama White House definition of it. But it's important to understand that even domestic agencies kind of glob onto that. But at the core of it is the State Department, the War Department, and the CIA. And then USAID sits in the middle of those. So when we had our first meeting of Congress as the United States of America in 1789, we created 3 government agencies: the State Department, the War Department, and the Treasury Department. I think we also created a Navy, but you can think of that as the War Department. So the State Department managed all of our world affairs on national interest. We had trade agreements that we were setting up. We had, supply chains with importing and exporting goods, tea and the like, for example, with the Boston, Tea Party event, etc., sugar. And we had a War Department for effectively national security, and then we had the Treasury Department for money. What happened over time is that State Department function, managing the American economy, managing American corporate power and American soft power influence in foreign countries, began to be a bigger and bigger task as America grew as an empire. 1898, we win the Spanish-American War. We get acquisition over basically Cuba, but also the Philippines. We militarily occupied the Philippines. Now we need a navy to protect our military empire. And then World War I, World War II. By the end of World War II, we now have a globe-spanning empire because we have a Marshall Plan in place where we are essentially paying European countries to have pro-American influence nodes. We are beginning to leverage that so that American companies can set up markets and have all these, hundreds of millions of new customers, supply chains, economic development. And we are getting rich as a country in the 20th century because all these American companies are now taking over the world and they're operating everywhere. They're getting really good deals because the State Department's juicing it. But at that time in the 1940s, after the Cold War, international law under the UN Declaration on Human Rights prohibited the ability to militarily occupy another country and have it be legal under international law. So we had to switch from overt military occupation to covert political influence in order to achieve the same effect, which is vassal state control, puppet control over a foreign government. So they nominally elect their own leader, but they have a Coke and Pepsi choice between the same product, 2 parties back-channeled by the U.S. State Department. So 1948, as international law is set up, the State Department bifurcates effectively. The State Department comes up with this idea that we should have a organized political warfare apparatus to covertly influence every country around the world, but because it has to be covert, it can't be housed within the State Department. We wouldn't be able to conceal it in our budget. We need to keep a layer of plausible deniability. So they proposed, this is George Kennan at the State Department in 1948, proposes the Central Intelligence Agency essentially take on this function as the covert arm of the State Department. When the Marshall Plan ran out in 1961, USAID, it goes international with USAID. And this is essentially a bribery, a influence capacity to use foreign assistance funds, humanitarian funds, development funds to pay groups, political networks, foundations to pass through onto other parties all around the world at a global scale in order to influence hearts and minds to help what the CIA and State Department want to do in the region. Meanwhile, and then on the national security side, you have the Department of War, but even the Department of War has something called the Civil Affairs Branch, which involves hearts and minds work. So psychological operations, Special forces often work with CIA and often work with USAID and the State Department to coordinate that Hearts and Minds campaign. This is how you see, for example, something like NATO having a planning meeting around whether Taylor Swift might be trainable to spread desired NATO messaging. You might be wondering, like, well, why is the military involved in that? Well, because this is part of this interagency blob. They move seamlessly together. Hillary Clinton, for example, when she was Secretary of State, had this model that she called the 3D model. Diplomacy, defense, and development always move together. Everywhere USAID works, they work with the U.S. military. If the USAID is doing a job fair in the region, the military knows about it. If the military is working with paramilitary groups that they want to do street protests or riots, and they're going to get fired by their Chinese employers in Africa if they take to the streets and riots, well, USAID can jump in with a job fair to help these economically disadvantaged folks fired from their Chinese factory jobs so that they can stay on the streets and protest and riot to help the DOD Special Forces paramilitary operation to overthrow the government in a street revolution. And so these things work symbiotically, but that's the middle layer of it. Diplomacy, war, intelligence, development, and these jobs are interchangeable. Like under Trump, Mike Pompeo was the head of the CIA. Very next job, he was promoted to Secretary of State. Notice he was promoted. You never go backwards that way. Nobody goes from Secretary of State to CIA director. That's a down step. The CIA director is the kids table. You're operating at the behest of the CIA, of the State Department or the War Department. You're the covert. You're the dirty work. You're essentially the hitman. You're not the mob boss. But what I'm getting at here is, like, Mike Pompeo went from CIA director to Secretary of State. How about Bill Clinton's CIA director, Leon Panetta, goes from CIA director to Secretary of War. These jobs are interchangeable. You can work at the CIA, the State Department, the Department of War, and USAID. It's the exact same resume. It's just the same job with a slightly different emphasis. But because it's the same job, they form one blob. And all of the different network nodes, the public-facing State Department nodes, the covert, secret influence CIA nodes, the public-facing military networks, the covert special forces soft power influence networks, the public-facing USAID grant programs, the covert subgrants and grantee and contractor network, they blend together as one mush, as one blob. So that's kind of the central guts layer, and it's a permanent thing because all these agencies have this fascinating dichotomy between politicals and careers. The president only gets to pick about 5,000 people to work for the government. All the other millions of federal government employees are like careers. They are there through Republican, through Democrat, and they're very hard to fire. And so there is a permanent bureaucracy that is able to control the levers and put their own kind of press on policy so that a president often has a really hard time getting something done unless the whole blob agrees that it should be done. And then above that, you got this banker and corporate class. These are the people who pay for the political campaigns. These are the people who sponsor, these are the multinational corporation, conglomerate, private equity, hedge fund folks. And this is tale as old as time. I mean, this is like, you can go back to United Fruit in the 1800s sponsoring presidents, and then presidents direct their Secretary of State or their Secretary of War to do things in Honduras and Guatemala that profit United Fruit. Today, that plays out with, on the Democrat side, figures like George Soros, the number one donor to the Democrat Party, will pay for these political campaigns, and then State Department policy on Brazil will promote Lula over Bolsonaro when Lula is implementing clean ethanol mandates that the Soros Management Fund is invested in. So they get a government-protected cartel so that Brazilians are forced to buy Soros portfolio company products because the election has been effectively rigged by Joe Biden sending his CIA director, Bill Burns, his Secretary of War, Lloyd Austin, his Undersecretary for Political Affairs, Victoria Nuland, down there, and spending tens of millions of USAID funding to back Lula groups. But it's not. But that is not a partisan thing. That happens on the Republican side too. This is Paul Singer. If you look up, his operations the same way. The Bush family and the big oil movement. I mean, who was Trump's first Secretary of State? It was Rex Tillerson, the chairman and CEO of ExxonMobil. He never worked in the State Department a day in his life, but he ran the world's biggest oil company, and a huge proportion of the Republican Party's power comes from the oil industry. And so you have these big oil, big energy, big military folks who contribute to Republicans, and then Republicans effectively donate them a Secretary of State or an Undersecretary who makes sure that they get their cut. But that is how the system works.